Hey guys, welcome to RedSunStories. Hope you're doing well. In tonight's story, a solitary fisherman learned that some legends are not stories at all. They are warnings. What rose from the depths that night would change not just his life, but the lives of everyone who came after him. So, before you get comfortable, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe if you enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments what time it is for you. I would love to connect with you guys. Now let's dive into tonight's story together. In the farthest reaches of the northern coast, where jagged cliffs rise like ancient sentinels against the endless gray expanse of the sea, there lived a fisherman whose name has been lost to the mists of time. The villagers who knew him called him simply Isamu, though few remained who remembered his face or the sound of his voice. He was a solitary man, weathered by salt and wind, his hands rough as driftwood, his eyes holding the distant gaze of one who has looked too long into the depths. His cottage stood alone on a rocky promontory, a small structure of weathered timber and thatched roof that groaned with every gust of wind from the ocean. Below, the waves crashed against black volcanic stones, their rhythm eternal and hypnotic, a lullaby that sang of both comfort and danger. Isamu had fished these waters since boyhood, following in the footsteps of his father and his father's father before him. The sea was his livelihood, his companion, and his adversary. He knew its moods as intimately as a lover knows the contours of a beloved's face. The gentle lapping of calm mornings, the sudden fury of afternoon squalls, the eerie stillness that preceded the great storms. He had learned to read the sky, to sense the turning of currents, to feel in his bones when the sea wished to give and when it demanded respect. Yet for all his knowledge, there remained mysteries in those dark waters that even the most experienced fisherman could never fully comprehend. On the night this tale begins, the air hung thick with moisture, as though the boundary between sea and sky had begun to dissolve. Fog rolled in from the eastern horizon, dense and gray, swallowing the stars one by one, until the world shrank to the narrow circle of Isamu's lamp-lit window. He sat at his small wooden table, mending a torn net by the flickering light of an oil lamp, his needle moving with practiced rhythm through the woven cord. Outside, the wind had fallen to an unnatural stillness, and the waves, which usually roared against the cliffs, seemed muted, their voices subdued to whispers. It was the kind of quiet that set a man's nerves on edge, the kind that spoke of something waiting just beyond the veil of perception. Isamu paused in his work, lifting his head to listen. The silence pressed against his ears like water pressure at depth. Even the night birds had ceased their calling. He rose slowly from his chair and moved to the window, peering out into the fog-shrouded darkness. The sea stretched before him, invisible now, its presence felt only through the faint hiss of waves against stone. Somewhere in that murk, something stirred. He could not say how he knew this, only that the certainty settled in his chest like a cold stone. The sea was watching. The sea was waiting. He had heard the stories, of course. Every fisherman knew the tales whispered in harbor taverns and around driftwood fires. Stories of the Umibozu, the great sea monk, a spirit that rose from the depths on nights like this, when fog and darkness merged into one. Some said it appeared as a massive black shadow, tall as a ship's mast, with a smooth, bald head like that of a Buddhist monk, and eyes that gleamed with the cold light of drowned stars. Others claimed it had no form at all, only a presence that filled the air with dread and made grown men weep with terror. The legends varied, but on one point they all agreed. When the Umibozu rose, it demanded tribute. A barrel of sake, a life, a promise, The price changed with each telling, but always there was a cost for safe passage through its waters. Isamu had never put much stock in such tales. The sea was dangerous enough without inventing monsters to populate it. Storms, rocks, treacherous currents. These were the real threats that claimed fishermen's lives. Superstition was for those who lacked the skill or courage to face the ocean on its own terms. Yet tonight, standing at his window and staring into the impenetrable fog, he felt the first cold tendrils of doubt creeping into his rational mind. The silence was too complete, the air too heavy with expectation. Something was different about this night. He returned to his chair and picked up the net once more, forcing his hands to continue their work. The repetitive motion brought comfort, a reminder of the ordinary world and its familiar rhythms. Thread through loop, pull tight, move to the next tear. His grandfather had taught him this skill when he was barely tall enough to see over the side of a boat. The old man's hands had been gnarled and scarred, but they moved through the net with surprising grace, creating patterns of repair that were almost beautiful in their precision. The sea gives and the sea takes, his grandfather had said, his voice rough as sand. But a good net, properly mended, will serve you for a lifetime. Remember that, boy. Care for your tools, respect the water, and you'll never go hungry. But his grandfather had also told other stories, late at night, when the sake had loosened his tongue and the shadows grew long. Stories of things he had seen far from shore, on those dark waters where land was only a memory, and the sky met the sea in an infinite circle. Once, he claimed, his boat had been surrounded by a strange luminescence, a cold green light that rose from the depths and made the water glow as though lit from within. Another time, he spoke of a morning when every fish in his nets had been found dead, their eyes wide and staring, their mouths open in what looked like screams. The sea has its own laws, the old man had whispered, and we are only guests in its realm. Never forget that. Isamu finished the last repair and set the net aside, rubbing his tired eyes. The lamp was burning low, its flame guttering in the still air. He should sleep. Morning would come early, and whether the fog lifted or not, he would need to check his nets and perhaps venture out if the weather permitted. Yet sleep felt impossible now. The unease that had settled over him had not lifted but grown stronger, a pressure at the base of his skull that made his jaw clench and his shoulders tense. He rose again and went to the small shrine he kept in the corner of his cottage, a simple wooden shelf with an offering bowl and a faded scroll depicting Ryujin, the dragon god of the sea. He had not made an offering in weeks, perhaps months. The ritual had seemed less urgent as the years passed, a habit from childhood that his practical adult mind found increasingly unnecessary. But tonight, moved by instinct rather than reason, he filled the bowl with a measure of sake from his small store and bowed his head before the shrine. The words of the traditional prayer came back to him haltingly at first, then more smoothly as memory took hold. He asked for safety on the waters, for full nets and fair winds, for protection from the unseen dangers that lurked beneath the waves. And then, almost as an afterthought, he added a request he had never made before. If the sea monk walks tonight, let him pass by this humble dwelling. I seek no quarrel with the spirits of the deep. The prayer complete, Isamu straightened and turned away from the shrine. The lamp finally died, plunging the cottage into darkness. He did not relight it, but instead felt his way to his sleeping mat in the corner, pulling the thin blanket over himself and listening to the muted sound of waves against stone. Sleep came eventually, but it was troubled, filled with dreams of drowning and darkness, of vast shapes moving beneath his boat, of water that rose up to claim him with cold, inexorable patience. He woke before dawn to find the fog even thicker than before, a gray wall that pressed against the windows and turned the world into a narrow sphere of existence. The cottage felt like a boat adrift in clouds, unmoored from the solid earth. Isamu dressed quickly in his worn fishing clothes, wrapped himself in his heavy oiled coat, and stepped outside into the damp embrace of the morning. The fog was so dense, he could barely see his own hands held out before him. It carried the sharp tang of salt, and something else, something faintly bitter, like burnt incense or charred wood. He made his way carefully down the narrow path that led from his cottage to the rocky beach below, each step taken with care, lest he slip on the moisture-slicked stones. His boat waited where he had left it, pulled up above the tide line and secured with rope. It was a small vessel, sturdy and well-maintained, with a single mast and a patched sail that had seen many seasons of service. Isamu ran his hand along the weathered gunwale, checking for any damage the night might have brought. Finding none, he began to prepare for the day's work. He loaded his nets, secured his tackle, filled a water skin, and placed a small package of rice balls wrapped in kelp into a waterproof box. The routine motions were comforting, a reminder of normalcy in a morning that felt anything but normal. The fog showed no sign of lifting as he pushed the boat into the shallow water and climbed aboard. His instincts told him to wait, to let the sun burn through the mist before venturing out. But something stronger than instinct drove him forward. He could not have named it if asked. Perhaps it was pride or stubbornness, or simply the fisherman's need to work regardless of conditions. Or perhaps, though he would not admit this even to himself, it was curiosity. The strange feeling that had gripped him since the previous evening had not faded with daylight. If anything, it had grown stronger, a pull toward the open water that felt almost like a summons. He set the small sail and guided the boat out past the breaking waves, using his intimate knowledge of the coastline to navigate through the fog. The rocks that could tear a hull to splinters lurked just beneath the surface, their positions marked only in memory and by the pattern of currents. Isamu steered by feel as much as by sight, reading the water's movement through the tiller's resistance, sensing the hidden obstacles through years of experience. Gradually, the sounds of the shore faded behind him, the crash of waves on stone, the cry of gulls, the whisper of wind through coastal grass. He was alone now, with the fog and the sea. The morning passed in an eerie half-light, the sun somewhere above but invisible, its presence known only through a gradual brightening of the gray that surrounded him. Isamu checked his nets at their usual locations, finding them empty or nearly so, a few small fish, hardly worth the effort of hauling them aboard. This was unusual. These waters were typically rich with life, providing more than enough to sustain a hard-working fisherman. But today, the sea seemed empty, abandoned, as though every living creature had fled to deeper waters or simply vanished into the murk. By midday, Isamu had moved farther from shore than he normally ventured, seeking better catches in unfamiliar waters. The fog had not lifted. If anything, it had grown thicker, reducing visibility to barely a boat length in any direction. He could no longer see the coastline or any landmark that might guide him home. Only the compass he kept secured in a wooden box gave him any sense of direction, its needle swaying slightly with the boat's motion, but always returning to point north. He was not yet worried. He had been lost in fog before and had always found his way back. but a small knot of unease tightened in his stomach. It was then that he noticed the silence. Not just the absence of human sounds or the usual noises of coastal life, but a deeper quiet, an absence of even the most basic environmental sounds. The water barely moved, the swells gentle and oddly regular, as though the sea had fallen into a trance. No birds called, no fish broke the surface. Even the wind had died completely, leaving the air perfectly still and heavy with moisture. Isamu lowered his sail and let the boat drift, his hands resting on the gunwales, his senses alert for any sound or sight that might explain the unnatural calm. And then he heard it, a sound so low and deep it was felt more than heard, a vibration that traveled through the water and up through the hull of his boat, resonating in his chest like the beat of some enormous heart. It came from ahead, somewhere in the fog, and it carried with it a quality that made his hands tremble and his breath catch in his throat. Not quite a voice, not quite a sound. Something between the two, ancient and patient and aware. The vibration ceased, leaving silence in its wake, but Isamu knew with absolute certainty that he was no longer alone on these waters. His first instinct was to grab the oars and row, to put as much distance as possible between himself and whatever waited ahead in the fog. But his hands would not obey, frozen by a mixture of fear and fascination that rooted him in place. The logical part of his mind screamed at him to flee, to trust his instincts and return to the safety of shore. Yet another part, deeper and older, whispered that running was useless. The thing in the fog had already seen him, already knew he was here, and if it wished to find him, no amount of rowing would save him. The fog ahead began to shift and swirl, as though disturbed by some great movement beneath the surface. Isamu watched, transfixed, as the gray clouds parted slowly, revealing first a darkness that seemed deeper than mere shadow, then a shape that rose from the water with terrible slowness. It was massive, far larger than his boat, larger than any whale or sea creature he had ever seen or imagined. The thing rose higher and higher, water streaming from its surface in sheets that caught the diffuse light and gleamed like mercury. And as it continued to rise, Isamu's mind struggled to comprehend what his eyes were seeing. Ahead, if it could be called that, smooth and round and dark as night, emerging from the sea like a moon rising above a black horizon. There was no hair, no ears, no features save for two enormous eyes that opened slowly, revealing orbs of pale light that fixed upon him with an intelligence that was utterly alien and yet somehow aware. The eyes held no malice, but neither did they hold any warmth or recognition of shared existence. They were the eyes of the deep ocean itself, old beyond measure, patient beyond human understanding, and absolutely indifferent to his terror. The body beneath the head was obscured by fog and water, but Isamu sensed its vastness, a presence that displaced the sea and made the very air feel heavier. This was the Umibozu, the sea monk of legend. Not a story after all, but real, rising before him from the depths where it had slumbered for who knew how many years or centuries. The creature, the spirit, the entity, whatever it was, loomed over his small boat like a mountain over a pebble, and Isamu understood in that moment just how insignificant he was, how fragile his existence, how easily the sea could reclaim him. Yet the Umibozu did not move to attack or overturn his boat. It simply watched him, those pale eyes unwavering, as though studying him or waiting for something. Isamu found his voice, though it emerged as barely more than a whisper, hoarse and trembling. Great Spirit, he said, the words coming from some instinctive place of ancient protocol. I am but a humble fisherman. I mean no disrespect to these waters or to those who dwell within them. I seek only to earn my living from the bounty of the sea. The Umibozu made no response, at least not in any way Isamu could perceive. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the gentle lapping of water against the hull of his boat. Then, slowly, the creature began to speak, not with words, but with that same deep vibration he had felt earlier, a sound that bypassed his ears and resonated directly in his chest, his bones, his mind. It was impossible to translate into human language, but Isamu understood its meaning nonetheless. The sea monk was asking him a question, though the nature of that question was not entirely clear. It wanted something from him, needed something, or perhaps was simply testing him in some way that mortal minds could not fully grasp. Isamu's hand moved almost without conscious thought to the small barrel he kept secured beneath his seat. It contained sake, the last of a batch he had been saving for a special occasion, or perhaps for offering at the shrine. With shaking hands, he lifted the barrel free and held it up toward the towering presence before him. I have this, he said, his voice steadier now. If it pleases the Great Spirit, it is all I can offer. Sake, made by the monks of the coastal temple, blessed and pure. Take it with my respect and my gratitude for allowing me to fish these waters. For a long moment, nothing happened. The Umibozu continued to watch him with those luminous eyes, its massive form motionless. Then, with a movement so swift Isamu barely registered it, a part of the creature, an appendage, an extension of its form, reached out and gently took the barrel from his hands. The touch was cold but not unpleasant, like being brushed by deep water, and in that brief contact Isamu felt something pass between them. Not communication exactly, but a kind of acknowledgement, a recognition that the offering had been received and accepted. The barrel disappeared into the fog and water surrounding the Umibozu's form. The creature's eyes continued to hold Isamu's gaze for another heartbeat, and in that moment, the fisherman felt as though he was being seen, truly seen, in a way that transcended physical sight. The sea monk knew him now, knew his thoughts and fears and the contents of his soul, knew him as completely as the ocean knows every grain of sand on its floor. It was terrifying and profound in equal measure, and Isamu found tears streaming down his weathered cheeks, though he could not have said whether they were born of fear or awe or some emotion that had no name in human language. Then, as slowly and deliberately as it had risen, the Umibozu began to descend. The massive form sank back into the water, the pale eyes closing, the darkness of its presence gradually swallowed by the gray sea. The fog swirled back in to fill the space where it had been, and within moments it was as though the encounter had never happened. Isamu was alone in his boat once more, surrounded by mist and silence, with only his racing heart and trembling hands as proof that he had faced the legendary sea monk and survived. He sat in stunned stillness for what might have been minutes or hours. Time seemed to have lost its meaning. Gradually, his awareness returned to the practical needs of the moment. He needed to return to shore. He needed to get home before nightfall. He needed to process what had just occurred, to make sense of an experience that defied all rational explanation. With shaking hands, he raised his sail once more and turned his boat toward where he hoped the coast would be, using the compass and his instincts to guide him through the fog. The journey back seemed to pass in a blur of gray and white, the monotony of rowing broken only by his own labored breathing and the soft splash of water against the hull. The fog began to thin as he approached the shore, though whether this was natural or somehow related to the Umibozu's departure, Isamu could not say. By the time he saw the familiar outline of his rocky promontory, the sun was hanging low in the western sky, its light breaking through the clouds in golden shafts that seemed almost unbearably beautiful after the oppressive gray of the day. He pulled his boat up onto the beach and secured it with rope, his movements automatic, his mind still processing the encounter. His legs felt weak as he climbed the path to his cottage, and he paused several times to rest, leaning against the rocks and staring out at the now calm sea. Had it really happened? Had he truly seen the Umibozu? Or had the fog and isolation played tricks on his mind? But no. The barrel was gone, taken by something, and the memory of those pale eyes and that deep vibration was too vivid, too real to be dismissed as hallucination. Inside his cottage, Isamu lit the lamp with trembling hands and sank onto his sleeping mat, too exhausted to prepare a meal or do anything more than lie still and breathe. His body ached as though he had rowed for days rather than hours, and his mind felt heavy, overwhelmed by the weight of what he had experienced. He closed his eyes and tried to sleep, but every time he began to drift off, he saw those eyes again, luminous and ancient, watching him from the darkness of his memory. Days passed, then weeks, and Isamu found himself changed by the encounter in ways both subtle and profound. He continued to fish, because fishing was what he knew and what he did, but he approached the sea now with a different attitude. The respect had always been there, born of practical understanding of the ocean's power, but now it was mixed with something deeper, reverence perhaps, or recognition of a presence that transcended the mere physical reality of water and waves. He made offerings at his shrine each morning before setting out, and he poured a small measure of sake into the sea whenever he dropped his nets, a tribute to the guardian spirit that lurked in the depths. Other fishermen noticed the change in him. In the village harbor, where boats gathered to unload their catches and men exchanged stories over cups of warm sake, Isamu had become quieter, more withdrawn. He no longer joined in the boisterous laughter or the exaggerated tales of the one that got away. When asked if something troubled him, he would simply shake his head and say that age was catching up with him, that the sea took more out of a man with each passing year. He never spoke of what he had seen, never mentioned the Umibozu, or the offering of sake, or those pale, knowing eyes. Some truths were too large to share, too strange to be believed, and he had no wish to be branded as a madman or a fool. But late at night, alone in his cottage with only the lamp for company, Isamu would sometimes write down fragments of his experience on scraps of paper, trying to capture in words what had been so far beyond words. He wrote of the fog and the silence, of the massive form rising from the water, of the sense of being seen by something infinitely older and wiser than himself. The papers accumulated in a small wooden box beneath his sleeping mat, a private record of an encounter that had forever altered his understanding of the world and his place within it. The sea itself seemed changed as well, or perhaps it was only his perception that had changed. On calm days, when the water stretched smooth and blue to the horizon, Isamu sometimes felt a watching presence, a sense that he was no longer alone even when no other boats were in sight. On stormy days, when the waves rose high and the wind howled like hungry ghosts, he heard beneath the chaos that same deep vibration, that pulse that came from the depths, and reminded him that the ocean had depths within depths, mysteries that no human would ever fully understand. His catches improved after the encounter, Though whether this was coincidence or the result of some unseen favor from the sea monk, Isamu could not say. His nets came up full more often than not, heavy with fine fish that brought good prices in the village market. Other fishermen grumbled about poor seasons and dwindling stocks, but Isamu's fortunes held steady. He did not boast about his success or draw attention to it, instead maintaining his quiet demeanor and always making his offerings before each journey onto the water. Years passed in this manner, the seasons turning in their eternal cycle. Isamu grew older, his hair turning silver, his movements slower but still sure. The younger fishermen began to regard him with a kind of respectful distance, sensing in him something they could not name but instinctively recognized. He had become, in his own way, a figure of the old world, a link to traditions and beliefs that the modern age was slowly eroding. When children asked him for stories, he told them tales of the sea, but always with a warning woven through the narrative, a reminder that the ocean demanded respect and that some mysteries were best left undisturbed. On the anniversary of his encounter with the Umibozu, a date he had marked carefully and never forgot, Isamu would make a special journey. He would take his boat out past the rocky headlands to the waters where he had met the sea monk, and there he would make an offering of sake poured directly into the waves. He would bow his head and offer a prayer of gratitude for being allowed to continue his work, for the bounty that sustained him, and for the privilege of having witnessed something beyond the ordinary realm of human experience. He never saw the Umibozu again on these anniversary voyages, but he felt its presence, a vast awareness that moved in the depths below, patient and eternal. Other fishermen began to notice his ritual, though few understood its significance. Some began to follow his example, making their own offerings before fishing, though they did so without fully comprehending why. The practice spread gradually through the village, becoming part of the local tradition, a small ceremony performed before setting out to sea, a moment of respect paid to the waters that provided their livelihood. Isamu never claimed credit for starting this tradition, never explained its origins. Some things, he had learned, were meant to be felt rather than spoken, understood through practice rather than explanation. The village itself began to change as well, slowly transforming from a collection of rough fishing huts into a more prosperous community. New families arrived, drawn by stories of good fishing and safe harbors. A proper shrine was built near the waterfront, dedicated to the spirits of the sea, and a young priest came to tend it. Isamu attended the dedication ceremony, standing at the back of the crowd and watching as the priest performed the blessings. When the priest spoke of the ocean's mysteries and the need to honor the spirits that dwelled within it, Isamu felt a quiet satisfaction, knowing that the lesson he had learned was being preserved, even if the full truth of his encounter remained his secret alone. But secrets have a way of surfacing, like objects from a sunken ship rising unexpectedly to the surface. One evening, many years after his encounter with the Umibozu, Isamu returned from a day of fishing to find the young priest waiting outside his cottage. The man was perhaps 30 years old, earnest and thoughtful, with the kind of face that inspired trust. He bowed respectfully as Isamu approached and asked if they might speak for a moment. Isamu, surprised but not displeased, invited him inside and prepared tea while the priest settled himself on the floor mat. "Forgive the intrusion, honored fisherman," the priest began once they were seated with steaming cups between them. "But I have been thinking much about the traditions of this village, trying to understand their origins and meanings. Many practices here are unusual, different from other coastal communities I have visited. The offerings to the sea before fishing, the prayers that invoke not just the general spirits, but something more specific, more present. I believe there is a story behind these customs, a story that has been forgotten or perhaps never told. And I have come to believe that you, Isamu-san, might know that story. Isamu sipped his tea slowly, his weathered face betraying nothing. Inside, his mind raced. He had kept his secret for so long, had told no one of what he had seen. But he was growing old now, his body weakening with each passing season. And he recognized that if the truth was to be preserved, it could not remain locked within him alone. Perhaps it was time. Perhaps this young priest, with his earnest face and genuine interest in the spiritual life of the sea, was the right person to hear what had happened on that fog-shrouded morning so many years ago. "You are perceptive," Isamu said finally, setting down his cup. "There is indeed a story, one I have not shared with anyone. But I wonder if you are prepared to believe it, young priest. The world grows more skeptical with each generation, more inclined to dismiss the old tales as superstition or fantasy." The priest leaned forward slightly, his eyes intent. "I have seen enough in my service to the spirits to know that the world contains mysteries beyond our understanding. I do not dismiss the old tales, Isamu-san. I believe they contain important truths, even when, especially when, they speak of things that defy easy explanation." And so, as the lamp burned low and the night deepened around them, Isamu told his story. He spoke slowly, choosing his words with care, describing the fog and the silence, the feeling of being summoned, the massive form rising from the water. He described the Umibozu in as much detail as he could remember. The smooth, dark head, the luminous eyes, the sense of vast intelligence and age. He spoke of the offering of sake, the moment of connection when the creature had touched his hand, the profound sense of being truly seen. And he spoke of the years since, of the changed relationship with the sea, of the feeling of being watched and protected. The priest listened without interruption, his face grave and attentive. When Isamu finished, silence filled the cottage, broken only by the distant sound of waves against the cliffs. Finally, the priest bowed deeply, his forehead nearly touching the floor. "Thank you for sharing this with me," he said quietly. "I believe you, Isamu-san, and I believe the Umibozu honored you by revealing itself, by accepting your offering. You were chosen, in some way, to be a witness to the sacred mysteries of the sea. The traditions that have grown up in this village are a reflection of that encounter, even if most people do not understand their origin. They are maintaining a connection to something vital, something that sustains both the community and the ocean itself." Isamu felt a weight lift from his shoulders, a burden he had not fully realized he was carrying. To be believed, to have his experience validated by someone who understood the spiritual dimensions of existence, was profoundly relieving. "What should I do with this knowledge?" he asked. "I am not a young man anymore. Perhaps it is time to ensure the story is not lost." The priest considered this for a moment, then nodded. "I think you should write it down, as fully and honestly as you can remember. Create a record that can be preserved at the shrine, a document for those who come after us. Not everyone need know of it. Some truths are too powerful for casual consumption. But it should exist, should be available for those who seek genuine understanding of the relationship between humans and the spirits of the sea. And I will ensure it is protected and honored." Over the following weeks, Isamu did exactly that. He spent his evenings writing out the full account of his encounter with the Umibozu, taking his time to capture every detail, every sensation, every emotion he had experienced. The act of writing was cathartic, a way of processing the experience anew, of understanding it from the perspective of age and reflection, rather than the immediate shock and awe of the moment. He wrote of the fear, yes, but also of the wonder, the sense of privilege at having witnessed something so far beyond the ordinary human experience. When the account was complete, he rolled it carefully and placed it in a wooden tube sealed with wax, then took it to the shrine and presented it to the priest. They performed a small ceremony, just the two of them, dedicating the document to the spirits of the sea and asking that it serve as a bridge between the human and spirit worlds. The priest placed it in a special alcove within the shrine's inner sanctum, where it would be safe from the elements and from careless hands. "It will be here," the priest assured him, "for as long as the shrine stands, and I will ensure that my successor understands its significance so that the knowledge passes down through the generations of priests who serve this place." Isamu felt a deep sense of peace as he left the shrine that day. He had fulfilled a responsibility he had not fully understood until the priest's visit, had ensured that his encounter with the Umibozu would not be lost to time and failing memory. The story would endure, would continue to remind those who learned of it that the sea was more than just water and fish, that it contained depths of mystery and wonder that demanded respect and reverence. The seasons continued their turn. Summer gave way to autumn, autumn to winter, the cycle repeating in its eternal pattern. Isamu's body grew frailer, his hands less steady, but he continued to fish as long as he was able, unwilling to abandon the life that had defined him. On his final voyage, though he did not know it would be his last, he took his boat out on a morning that reminded him of that fateful day so many years ago. The fog was thick, the sea calm, the air heavy with moisture and expectation. He set his nets and waited, feeling the gentle rock of the boat beneath him, listening to the whisper of waves against the hull. And as he sat there in the gray embrace of the fog, he felt that familiar presence once more, that sense of being watched by something vast and ancient. He did not see the Umibozu this time. The sea monk did not rise from the depths, but he knew it was there, knew it was aware of him, knew that in some way they remained connected by that long-ago encounter. "Thank you," Isamu whispered into the fog, his voice thin with age but steady with conviction. "Thank you for the years you have given me, for the fish that filled my nets, for the privilege of knowing you exist. I have tried to honor you in my life and my work. I have tried to teach others to respect the sea as more than just a resource to be exploited. I hope I have done well enough." The fog seemed to grow somehow warmer, the presence somehow closer, and Isamu felt what might have been a response. Not words, but that same deep vibration he remembered from all those years ago, resonating in his bones and his heart. It carried a sense of approval, of acknowledgement, of something that might almost be called affection, if such a human emotion could be ascribed to a being so far beyond human. The sea monk remembered him. The sea monk knew he had kept faith. Isamu pulled in his nets that day to find them full to bursting with fine fish, more than his small boat could safely carry. He released half of them back into the water with a prayer of gratitude, kept what he needed, and began the slow journey back to shore. His arms ached with the effort of rowing. His breath came hard and labored, but his heart was light. He had lived a good life, a meaningful life, and he had been granted knowledge of mysteries that most would never glimpse. He reached the shore as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Other fishermen helped him pull his boat up onto the beach, exclaiming over his catch, asking what his secret was. Isamu just smiled and shook his head, saying only that the sea had been generous today. He walked slowly up the path to his cottage, his legs trembling with exhaustion, and paused at the top to look back at the water. The fog had cleared completely now, and the sea stretched before him in the fading light, vast and dark and beautiful. Somewhere in its depths, the Umibozu waited, patient and eternal, guardian of mysteries that would outlast empires and ages. Isamu bowed deeply toward the water, a gesture of respect and farewell, though whether he knew it was farewell, even he could not have said. That night, Isamu lay down on his sleeping mat and closed his eyes for the last time. His death was quiet and peaceful, his body simply giving up after years of hard labor and the natural wearing away of time. The villagers found him the next morning, his face calm and settled, his hands folded across his chest. They prepared him for burial with all the honors due to a respected elder, and laid him to rest in the cemetery that overlooked the sea. The priest who had heard Isamu's story spoke at the funeral, saying words about the connection between a fisherman and the ocean that sustained him, about respect for the natural world and the spirits that dwelled within it. He did not mention the Umibozu by name or reveal the specifics of Isamu's encounter, but those who were sensitive to such things felt that there was more being said than the surface words conveyed. And as they stood by the grave, several people noticed that the fog had rolled in again, thick and gray, and that somewhere in that fog, far out to sea, there seemed to be a dark shape rising and falling with the swells, as though something massive was paying its own respects to the man who had honored it. In the years that followed, Isamu's cottage was eventually torn down, replaced by a newer structure built by a younger fisherman. But the shrine remained, and within it, carefully preserved in its wooden tube, the document Isamu had written continued to wait for those who sought deeper understanding. Occasionally, a fisherman facing particularly difficult circumstances would be granted access to read it, and would emerge from the shrine with a changed expression, a new understanding of what it meant to work upon the waters. The tradition of making offerings before fishing not only continued, but strengthened, and stories of the Umibozu, once dismissed as mere superstition, were told again with renewed respect and belief. The sea itself remained as it had always been, vast, powerful, mysterious, and ultimately unknowable. But those who fished its waters with respect and humility found that it provided for them, that their catches were sufficient, that they returned home safely more often than not. And on foggy mornings, when the boundary between sea and sky dissolved into gray obscurity, some fishermen would swear they saw shapes moving in the mist, massive and dark and patient. Most would pull in their nets and return to shore on such days, heeding the ancient wisdom that some mysteries were best left undisturbed. But a few, the brave or the foolish, or perhaps the chosen, would remain on the water, would drop their offerings into the waves, would wait with pounding hearts to see if they too might glimpse what Isamu had seen. Some claimed they did, though their accounts varied and were often dismissed by skeptics. Others saw nothing but returned with a profound sense of having been in the presence of something greater than themselves, something that had observed them and found them worthy of continued existence. The legend of the Umibozu grew and changed with each retelling, as legends do. Some versions emphasized the terror of the encounter, painting the sea monk as a fearsome creature that demanded tribute, or else would drag unfortunate sailors to watery graves, Others spoke of it as a protector, a guardian spirit that watched over those who showed proper respect to the ocean. Both versions contained truth, perhaps, for the Umibozu was not a simple thing that could be reduced to good or evil, benevolent or malevolent. It simply was a force of nature or beyond nature that existed according to laws humans could not fully comprehend. Scholars occasionally visited the village, drawn by stories of the unusual maritime traditions and the persistent belief in sea spirits. Some dismissed it all as quaint folklore, the product of isolated communities that still clung to primitive superstitions. Others, more open-minded or perhaps more perceptive, sensed that there was something genuine at the heart of these beliefs, something that spoke to a relationship between humans and nature that the modern world had largely forgotten. A few were granted permission to read Isamu's account, and these scholars invariably left the village changed, their academic skepticism tempered by the sincerity and detail of the fisherman's testimony. One such scholar, a professor of folklore from a prestigious university, spent several months in the village conducting interviews and research. He was a methodical man, trained to approach supernatural claims with skepticism and to seek natural explanations for seemingly inexplicable events. But the more he learned about Isamu and the traditions that had grown from his encounter, the more his certainty wavered. The account preserved at the shrine was too detailed, too specific, too devoid of the embellishments that usually characterized folk tales. And the changes in the village that had followed Isamu's encounter, the improved fishing yields, the strengthened sense of community, the revival of traditional practices, were documented facts, not mere legends. The professor interviewed fishermen who claimed to have had their own encounters with the Umibozu, or at least to have felt its presence. Their stories varied in specifics, but shared certain common elements: the fog, the silence, the sense of being watched by something vast and ancient, the feeling of profound insignificance in the face of the ocean's power. Some had made offerings and felt them accepted. Others had simply maintained a reverential attitude while working the waters and believed this had protected them from harm. None could prove what they claimed, but the sincerity of their belief was undeniable. In the end, the professor left the village with more questions than answers, his carefully constructed framework of rational skepticism shaken, but not entirely demolished. He published a paper on the maritime traditions of the region, noting the unusual persistence of spiritual beliefs in an increasingly secular age. But he could not bring himself to definitively state whether the Umibozu was real or merely a particularly powerful communal myth. Perhaps, he concluded, the distinction between those two categories was less clear than he had previously believed. Perhaps some truths existed in a space between objective fact and subjective experience, accessible only to those who approach them with the right combination of openness and respect. As the years became decades and the decades began to approach a century, the village continued to change and grow. Modern technology arrived: engines for boats, sonar for finding fish, weather forecasting that made fishing safer and more predictable. Yet despite these innovations, the old traditions persisted. Fishermen still made their offerings before setting out. The shrine still stood watch over the harbor, and on foggy mornings, when the past seemed to press close against the present, people still spoke in hushed voices of the Umibozu and the fishermen who had met it face to face and lived to tell the tale. Isamu's name became a kind of touchstone in the village, a symbol of the proper relationship between humans and the sea. Children were told stories of the respectful fishermen who had honored the ocean and been honored in return. Young people setting out to make their living from the water were encouraged to follow Isamu's example of humility and reverence. And occasionally, when someone faced a crisis or a moment of profound choice, they would be told to think about what Isamu would have done, to consider the lessons embedded in his story. The wooden tube containing Isamu's account remained in the shrine, though by now it was considered a precious relic, opened only on rare and special occasions. The priest who succeeded, the one Isamu had known, took his duties seriously, understanding that he was the guardian of something more than just a piece of paper. He was preserving a link to the sacred, maintaining a connection between the ordinary world of fishing boats and market stalls and the extraordinary realm where spirits moved through the deep waters and consciousness extended beyond the boundaries of flesh. On the 100th anniversary of Isamu's encounter, a date calculated from the best estimates available, the village held a special ceremony at the shrine. Fishermen gathered from throughout the region, drawn by word of the commemoration. The current priest, a descendant of the man who had first heard Isamu's story, performed traditional blessings and read selected passages from the preserved account. The crowd listened in respectful silence, many with tears in their eyes, as the words painted pictures of that long-ago morning when one man had come face to face with the mystery at the heart of their profession. After the ceremony, a procession of boats ventured out to sea, each carrying offerings of sake that were poured into the waves at the location where Isamu had encountered the Umibozu. The day was calm and clear. No fog obscured the horizon, but as the offerings splashed into the water and dispersed into the blue depths, more than one person reported feeling that deep vibration, that pulse that seemed to come from the ocean floor itself. Perhaps it was imagination. Perhaps it was the shared emotion of the moment creating a kind of collective experience. Or perhaps the Umibozu was there, accepting the tribute, remembering the fishermen who had honored it and in turn honored the generations that followed. The boats returned to harbor as evening fell, and the fishermen gathered at a local establishment to share food and drink and stories. The atmosphere was festive, but also contemplative, as though everyone present understood that they had participated in something significant, a reaffirmation of ancient bonds between their community and the sea that sustained it. Old fishermen spoke of their own encounters with the mysterious and the unexplained, while younger ones listened with the respect due to those whose experience spanned decades of working the waters. As the night deepened and the crowd gradually dispersed, one elderly fisherman remained, nursing a cup of sake and staring out at the dark water visible through the open doorway. He had been perhaps the last person to know Isamu personally, having been a boy when the old fisherman died. His memories of Isamu were fragmentary, an impression of weathered hands mending nets, a quiet voice telling stories by a driftwood fire, a sense of someone who carried secret knowledge but wore it lightly. "Do you think it's still out there?" asked a younger fisherman, settling beside the old man. "The Umibozu? Or was it just something that appeared once and then disappeared back into legend?" The old man was silent for a long moment, his gaze still fixed on the water. "I think," he said finally, "that some things are always out there, whether we see them or not. The sea is deep, deeper than we can imagine. And there are old things in those depths, things that were here before us and will be here long after we're gone. The Umibozu is one of those things. It doesn't matter whether it shows itself to us or not. It's there, has always been there. Isamu saw it because he was meant to see it, because the time and the person were right. The rest of us, we work the water, we pay our respects, and we trust that the old bargains still hold." The younger fisherman nodded slowly, absorbing this. And the offerings we make? Do you think they actually mean anything to something like that? I think they mean something to us, the old man replied. They remind us that we're not alone out there, that we're part of something larger than ourselves. Whether the Umibozu needs sake or not, we need to give it. We need the ritual, the acknowledgement, the humility of admitting that we don't control the sea. We just work upon it by permission. That's what Isamu understood, I think. That's what made his life meaningful. They sat in companionable silence as the night grew late. The sound of waves against the harbor wall a constant background to their thoughts. Eventually, the younger fisherman rose and bid farewell, heading home to his family. The old man remained a while longer, finishing his sake and thinking about the long chain of generations that stretched from Isamu's time to his own and onward into a future he would not see. Each generation faced the sea anew, learned its lessons, sometimes at great cost. But they were not starting from nothing. They had the stories, the traditions, the accumulated wisdom of those who had gone before. And at the heart of it all was that encounter, that moment when one man had stood before mystery and somehow found the right response. Finally, he too rose and made his way home through the quiet streets, his body aching with the weight of years spent hauling nets and battling waves. Tomorrow, he would go out again, as he had done for decades, because that was what fishermen did. But tonight, he carried with him a renewed sense of purpose, a feeling that his work was part of something greater than mere survival or commerce. He was maintaining a relationship, fulfilling an obligation that transcended individual lives and connected past to future through the medium of respect and ritual. The sea rolled on through the night, eternal and indifferent and yet somehow aware, its waves carrying messages written in salt and foam that only those who spent their lives upon it could begin to read. And in its depths, where light faded to darkness and pressure became crushing, where the bones of ancient ships lay scattered on the ocean floor, the Umibozu waited, patient, timeless, guardian of the boundary between the known and the unknown, the mundane and the sacred. It had no need of sleep or rest, no cycle of day and night to govern its existence. It simply was, a permanent fixture of the ocean's deepest places, a reminder that for all humanity's advances and achievements, there remained mysteries beyond its reach. Sometimes, on certain nights when the moon hung low and full over the water, fishermen claimed to see shapes moving beneath their boats, vast shadows that were too large and too deliberate to be whales or any other natural creature. They would watch these shapes in terrified fascination, holding their breath, waiting to see if this would be their moment of encounter. Most often, the shadows would glide past and disappear into the depths, leaving only a disturbed patch of water and a pounding heart as evidence of their passing. But the knowledge that they were there, that something ancient and powerful moved through those waters, colored every moment spent upon the sea. This was Isamu's legacy, though he could never have anticipated how far it would reach or how long it would endure. He had simply been a fisherman who encountered something beyond his understanding and had the wisdom to respond with respect rather than violence or flight. He had honored what he did not comprehend, had maintained the connection even when he could not fully explain it, and in doing so, had taught a lesson that transcended his own life and became part of the cultural fabric of his community. He had given them not just a story, but a way of being in the world, a framework for understanding their relationship with the sea that sustained them. And perhaps, though this could never be proven, the Umibozu had recognized in Isamu something worth preserving, some quality of humility or openness or respect that had become increasingly rare among humans. Perhaps in accepting his offering, the sea monk had made its own kind of bargain, agreeing to watch over these waters and the people who fished them as long as they maintained that same attitude of reverence. The improved catches that Isamu and his descendants enjoyed might have been nothing more than coincidence and good technique, or they might have been the fulfillment of an unspoken agreement between the human and spiritual worlds. Years turned to decades, decades to generations, and still the story persisted. New threats emerged to challenge the fishing community: climate change altering fish migration patterns, industrial fishing fleets from distant nations depleting stocks, pollution seeping into coastal waters. The village faced difficulties that Isamu could never have imagined, pressures that threatened not just individual livelihoods, but the entire way of life that had sustained coastal communities for centuries. Yet through all these changes, the traditions he had helped establish remained a source of strength and continuity. When faced with the intrusion of industrial fishing vessels into their traditional waters, the village fishermen banded together, united by a shared sense of stewardship that went beyond mere economic interest. They spoke at regional councils and government hearings about the need to protect not just fish stocks, but the sacred relationship between people and sea. Their arguments were rooted in spiritual as well as practical concerns. And while officials sometimes dismissed the spiritual elements as quaint superstition, the passion and sincerity behind the words made an impact. Regulations were eventually put in place to limit industrial fishing in certain coastal zones, preserving spaces where traditional methods could continue. The shrine by the harbor became a focal point for environmental activism, with the priest organizing beach cleanups and educational programs about ocean conservation. Young people who might otherwise have left for cities found purpose in protecting the waters their ancestors had revered. They learned to see their work not as backward-looking nostalgia, but as forward-thinking stewardship, maintaining practices that were sustainable and respectful in ways that modern industrial methods were not. The Umibozu legend became part of this environmental consciousness, a reminder that the ocean was not merely a resource to be exploited, but a living presence, deserving of respect. Scientists who came to study the region's marine ecosystems found themselves drawn into conversations about the spiritual dimensions of conservation. Some remained skeptical, insisting on purely materialistic explanations for phenomena like the improved fish catches around the village. But others began to wonder if there might be something to the old ways after all. Not supernatural intervention necessarily, but perhaps a psychological and social framework that encouraged sustainable practices and fostered a deeper connection to place. When fishermen approached the sea with reverence and restraint, when they made offerings and gave thanks, they were more likely to fish responsibly, to avoid overharvesting, to notice and respond to changes in the ecosystem. The spiritual practices had practical benefits, whether or not one believed in the literal existence of sea spirits. The debate about the Umibozu's reality continued across generations, with each new generation finding its own way to engage with the legend. Some embraced it as literal truth, maintaining absolute faith in the existence of the sea monk and its ongoing presence in the waters. Others interpreted it metaphorically, seeing it as a personification of the ocean's power and mystery rather than an actual entity. Still others suspended judgment entirely, neither believing nor disbelieving, but simply participating in the rituals and traditions because they felt meaningful and connected them to their heritage. What united all these perspectives was a shared recognition that the story of Isamu's encounter had profoundly shaped their community. Whether the Umibozu was real or not, the values it represented, respect for nature, humility before forces greater than oneself, the importance of maintaining proper relationships with the world beyond human control, remained vital and relevant. The legend had become a teaching tool, a way of transmitting wisdom across generations, in a form that was memorable and emotionally resonant. On particularly stormy nights, when the wind howled around the harbor and waves crashed against the breakwater with terrifying force, people would gather in homes and speak in hushed voices about the sea and its moods. Children pressed close to their parents, listening wide-eyed to stories of fishermen who had ventured out in defiance of warnings and never returned, of boats found empty and drifting with no sign of their crews, of strange lights seen moving beneath the waves. And always, eventually, someone would tell Isamu's story, recounting how one humble fisherman had faced the Umibozu with an offering of sake and lived to fish another day. The story served as both warning and reassurance. Warning that the sea demanded respect, reassurance that respect properly given would be received. The document Isamu had written, preserved in its wooden tube at the shrine, became increasingly fragile with age despite careful storage. The priest consulted with archivists and conservators, seeking ways to preserve the original while also creating copies that could be shared more freely. Digital scans were made, transcriptions created in modern script, translations prepared for researchers from other countries. Yet even as these modern versions proliferated, the original remained the most valued, imbued with a sense of authenticity and sacred presence that copies could not quite capture. To read Isamu's own handwriting, to see the places where his brush had hesitated or moved with particular emphasis, was to feel a direct connection to the man and his experience. A small museum opened in the village, dedicated to maritime history and the traditional fishing culture of the region. Isamu's story featured prominently in the exhibits, with displays explaining the legend of the Umibozu and its significance in local folklore. Visitors from around the world came to learn about this unique blend of practical fishing knowledge and spiritual belief, and many left with a changed perspective on humanity's relationship with the natural world. In an age of environmental crisis and alienation from nature, the village offered a model of how traditional ecological knowledge and spiritual practices could inform more sustainable ways of living. As the climate continued to change and ocean temperatures rose, altering currents and disrupting ecosystems, the fishermen noticed changes in their waters. Species that had been common became rare, while others previously unknown in these latitudes began to appear. The sea was transforming before their eyes, and they wondered what this meant for the old agreements and understandings. If the physical ocean was changing so dramatically, did the spiritual dimensions change as well? Did the Umibozu still watch over these waters, or had it retreated to deeper, colder seas as the warming progressed? These questions sparked intense debates at community gatherings. Some argued that the spirits were eternal and unchanging, that the Umibozu would remain regardless of surface conditions. Others suggested that spiritual entities might be as affected by environmental change as physical creatures, that the damage humans were inflicting on the ocean might wound the spirits as well as the fish. A few proposed that the environmental crisis itself was a sign that humans had broken faith with the sea, that they had collectively failed to maintain the respect and restraint that Isamu's story taught. In response to these concerns, the community doubled down on their traditional practices while also embracing modern conservation efforts. They lobbied for marine protected areas, participated in coral restoration projects, worked to reduce plastic pollution in their waters. But they also continued the offerings, the prayers, the ceremonies that connected them to the spiritual dimension of their relationship with the sea. They saw no contradiction in this dual approach. Both the scientific and the spiritual had their place. Both offered valid and necessary perspectives on the crisis facing the oceans. A young woman named Aiko, a direct descendant of Isamu, though she bore a different family name through the maternal line, became particularly active in these conservation efforts. She had studied marine biology at university, but had returned to the village rather than pursuing opportunities in the city, driven by a sense of obligation to her heritage and the waters that had sustained her family for generations. She often visited the shrine, reading her ancestors' account and feeling a personal connection to his experience that went beyond mere genealogy. One evening, as she prepared to lead a night dive to survey local reef health, Aiko made an offering at the shrine and spoke aloud to the Umibozu, though she felt foolish doing so. "I don't know if you're real," she said quietly, "or if you're just a story my family has told for generations. But if you are real, if you truly watch over these waters, then you must see what's happening to them. The coral is bleaching. The fish populations are crashing. The plastic is everywhere. We're trying to fix it, but we're so small compared to the scale of the problem. If you have any power, any influence, we could use your help." She received no answer, of course, or at least none that she could perceive. But as she descended into the dark water that night, her headlamp cutting through the blackness to illuminate patches of reef, she felt an unusual sense of calm and purpose. The dive revealed both damage and resilience, areas where the coral had died, but also pockets where it remained vibrant, fish still gathered in surprising numbers. It was not a picture of total devastation, but rather of an ecosystem under stress, yet still fighting to survive. Much like the fishing community itself, she thought. Over the following months, Aiko's conservation work began to yield unexpected results. Her efforts to rally the community around specific restoration projects succeeded beyond what her organizational skills alone could explain. Fishermen volunteered time and boats for reef surveys. Young people showed up for beach cleanups in numbers that surprised everyone. Funding materialized from sources that had previously shown no interest in small coastal projects. It felt almost as though invisible forces were aligning to support the work, though Aiko knew such thinking was probably just wishful pattern seeking. Or was it? Late one night, anchored over a restoration site and preparing to sleep on her small research boat, Aiko woke to a strange sensation. The water around her boat was glowing with bioluminescence, a phenomenon not uncommon in these waters, but particularly intense tonight. Millions of tiny organisms lit up with each movement of the waves, creating patterns of blue-green light that pulsed and swirled in mesmerizing complexity. She stood at the rail, transfixed, watching the light show. And then, in the midst of the bioluminescence, she saw, or thought she saw, a darker shape, massive and deep, moving beneath the surface. It was there for only a moment before disappearing into the depths. But in that brief glimpse, Aiko felt the same thing her ancestor must have felt more than a century ago. The presence of something vast and aware, something that noticed her and acknowledged her efforts. She stood trembling, her scientific mind warring with a more primal response, unable to fully process what she had witnessed. Was it the Umibozu? A whale? A trick of light and shadow and exhausted perception? She would never know for certain. But the encounter, if it could be called that, reinforced her commitment to the conservation work. Whether or not spiritual forces were involved, the ocean was worth protecting for its own sake, and her family's legacy gave her both the responsibility and the inspiration to continue fighting for its preservation. The years ahead would bring more challenges, more changes, more losses, and occasional victories in the ongoing struggle to maintain both the physical and spiritual health of the coastal waters. But Aiko and those who worked alongside her drew strength from the knowledge that they were part of a long tradition of people who had faced the sea with respect and humility, who had recognized that human power was limited and that some things remained forever beyond their control. The story of Isamu and the Umibozu served as a touchstone, a reminder that their work was about more than just fish populations or economic sustainability. It was about maintaining a relationship, honoring an obligation that stretched back through generations and forward into a future they might never see. And so the tale continues, passed from grandparent to grandchild, from priest to successor, from one generation of fishermen to the next. The Umibozu may or may not rise from the depths again to confront a solitary human with its immense presence, but its story lives on, shaping how a community understands itself and its place in the world, providing guidance for how to live in harmony with forces that dwarf human concerns. In this sense, the sea monk is always present, always watching, its pale eyes luminous in the darkness of the deep, patient and eternal. The coastal wind still carries the scent of salt and seaweed. The waves still crash against ancient rocks. The fog still rolls in on certain mornings, thick and gray, transforming the familiar world into something strange and liminal. And when that fog comes, the fishermen pause in their preparations, make their offerings, and venture onto the water with both confidence and humility, knowing that they sail upon mysteries that will never be fully understood. This is the legacy of Isamu, not certainty, but wisdom, not conquest, but coexistence, not mastery of the sea, but membership in the vast community of life that calls it home. His encounter with the Umibozu taught him, and through him taught all who came after, that the proper human posture before the ocean is one of respect mixed with awe, of practical skill tempered by spiritual awareness, of taking what is needed while giving thanks for what is received. As night falls over the village and lamps begin to glow in windows along the harbor, the sea continues its eternal conversation with the shore, speaking in a language older than words. And somewhere in those depths, in the cold darkness where even light cannot penetrate, something ancient stirs and settles and waits, patient as stone, timeless as the tide. The Umibozu sleeps but does not dream, watches but does not judge, exists in a state beyond human categories of being and non-being. Let the waves carry you now into rest, as they carried Isamu through his long life upon the water. Let the rhythm of the tide lull you into peace, knowing that some mysteries are meant not to be solved, but simply to be honored. And if you wake in the night to the sound of waves against shore, remember that the sea is speaking its ancient language, telling stories that began before memory and will continue long after we have all returned to the elements from which we came. The tale of the Umibozu and of the fishermen who faced it with nothing but respect and a barrel of sake is complete. But like all true stories, it has no real ending, only a pause, a moment of reflection, before the next chapter begins with another dawn, another tide, another journey onto waters that hold within their depths both danger and wonder, both death and life, both the ordinary and the sacred intertwined. Sleep now and dream of the sea.